This lecture is on the developing political and economic freedom that was occurring in the European Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So we have to stress that for people to develop things like art and civilization and learning and all those wonderful things, there has to be a financial basis, right? If you're struggling to survive, if you're spending most of your day just trying to find food to eat or working in a field, you're not going to have time to do much else. You're going to be exhausted. You can't then go write a wonderful novel or make a beautiful piece of art or anything like that. So we have to understand that at the foundation pretty much of any kind of historical accomplishment is the economy. And what's going to happen is the rise of Europe, and in particular the ability of Europe to join the so-called Old and New Worlds, is going to be based on a rising economy, and in particular the medieval commercial revolution. So remember how we talked about manoralism and we talked about the monasteries? Well, they were starting to produce more and more over time, right? Europeans were discovering new modes of production, new kinds of tools that would help them increase the amount of production. For example, they developed horse collars that would allow horses to pull plows rather than oxen, and horses can pull plows a lot faster. And you can kind of see here, remember we talked about monasteries, you've got the monks praying, but then also going out to work. And what's going to happen is over time, people are going to get better at farming, develop new techniques, and so the manors that were at the heart of manoralism and the monasteries are going to start producing more food, right? So they're going to have a surplus. And when you have a surplus, you can grow for the market. You're not just thinking, okay, what do we need in order to survive here? You're thinking, okay, we've got enough to survive. We can grow some more and sell it on the market. So that reorients how you think about food production or producing wool or anything like that, right? We don't just have to make enough for ourselves and our community. We can grow more, and we can grow it for the market and sell it there. And typically what's going to happen then, and we've seen this many times in our class, but I'm still going to just stress it again. What happens is once people have a surplus and are selling on the market, and once there's a surplus where you can actually sell, then people will start to specialize in one item and sell it to buy what they need on the market, right? I know that I can buy grain on the market. So you know what? I'm not going to bother growing grain. I'm going to grow cotton. I'm going to take that land and change it so that it will be used for grazing for sheep to raise wool. Or I'm going to plant grapevines and grow grapes and make wine because I know I can sell that wine and then buy the food I need on the market. And what's going to happen is some people are going to become so efficient, so good at producing finished goods that they actually need to import raw materials. So for example, some areas in Europe get really good at producing wool, and wool cloth. They get really good at producing wool cloth, and they're just famous all over Europe for it, and everyone wants to buy their stuff. And they actually run out of wool from local suppliers. So they have to start importing wool internationally in order to make cloth, which they then export internationally, right? People are producing so much that they need to import raw materials, right? They can't just depend on local materials. And so you have the rise of international trade. And of course, like I say, they import that wool internationally. They're going to export the wool cloth internationally as well. And just to give you a sense that the people at this time even understood what was going on, a 13th century author wrote this. They send their wine to Paris, and he's referring to the local monks, because they have a river at hand that flows there. And they sell it for a good price from which they buy all their food and clothes. So this monastery has decided that, you know what, we're not going to worry about making food. We're not going to worry about producing wool for clothing. We have great grapes. We can make excellent wine. So we're just going to make a lot of that and then sell it and buy what we need on the market. So we have a transformation going on in the medieval economy. It's growing. But it's not only just still getting bigger, it's developing, right? It's not simply about we're producing more food. It's like, okay, Now we can specialize and make even better products than what we once had. And that must be some really good wine, because you can see the monk here stealing wine. This is from a book, and they would often illuminate the first letters. That seems to be an A. And he's stealing the wine that he's not supposed to be, and that's why he's kind of looking behind him, make sure no one catches him. Bad monk. So to kind of continue then, trade is increasing, and so do connections between communities. And remember, in manorialism, you had this situation where people produced just what they needed. And there wasn't much of a point in me trading, because, the wheat I have is pretty much very similar to the wheat my neighbor in the village, over the mountains. It's pretty much the same thing. So I'm not going to bother trading with them. But now, as people are growing so much, selling on markets, specializing to make products that become famous all over Europe, trade will increase, and so do the connections between the different communities. And I want to stress, this trade often reaches out of Europe. This trade is often international. And in particular, Italy. Remember how we talked about Rome? One reason it was so outward looking was it was a peninsula, lots of good harbors. Italy, even though it's not unified into one state at this time, is similar, right? Still a peninsula. There's all these little different kingdoms. They're going to be emphasizing international trade. They're going to go all over the Mediterranean, even trading with the Islamic world. And as international trade increases, so does currency, right? You can, in the times of manorialism, they had coins, they had currency, but you didn't need that much of it because you weren't doing that much trade. And what trade you were doing could be handled by barter, because you're not trading, you're not traveling very far. But as people start traveling very far, right, they need something they can carry with them. So there's a development of currency. More and more coins are being used, which of course makes it easier to tax people and easier to run the economy. Banking is also further developed, right? When you do international trade, it's very helpful to have banking, right? They'll even develop checks, right? Where you can have a bank that has branches in Italy, for example, and then also has branches in Germany. And you can go from Italy to Germany, and instead of carrying lots of money with you, which you could easily have stolen from you, you can bring a check so that you can take money from the branch in Germany, same bank. You can take money out of that branch after having deposited it in Italy. So we had this very, very advanced kind of economy developing here. Now, towns that had in the past been primarily focused on administration or religion. What made a town big was the fact that that was a place where the government was, and they needed lots of people to help them do their tasks and to provide services for the people who worked for the government. Or it was important because it was an important religious shrine, or that's where the bishop was, or something like that. But increasingly, towns are going to become more important economically, because that's where markets will be. And frequently people are going to be coming to the towns in order to trade, right? That's, like I said, that's where the markets will be. Merchants want to set up stores or have trade fairs where there's going to be a lot of customers. And of course, towns are perfect. And also, though, towns won't just become centers of trade, they'll also increasingly become centers of production, right? You want to have a workshop where you make wool into wool clothing, put it in a town, right? That way you'll have access to labor. You'll have access to, you'll be able to buy the food you need from the cloth you sell. So we're going to have increasing urbanization, right? As towns become more important economically. And that's great because, as we talked about before in this class, that leads to further development in civilization, right? It's easier to have advanced culture, advanced literature, all those great things when you have population density, right? We talked about that way back with the Mesopotamians. So this leads to the rise of towns, right? This leads to the rise of towns. Now, here's the thing. Economic development demands labor. As you have towns getting bigger and economic activity increases in towns, you have more people moving to towns. One thing I should point out, usually towns are negative demographically. Towns are often unhealthy. You can get an idea from looking at this image here compared to the countryside. And so towns typically had more people die than were born and relied on an influx of people coming from the countryside looking for work. But the key thing is we have economic development in the towns. So there's a labor demand, right? You want to start a new factory, you want to start a new shop, you need people to work there. So more and more people are going to be flocking to these towns. So serfs will increasingly leave the fields for the towns and become increasingly free. Now you may say, wait a second, I didn't think serfs were allowed to do that. And it's like, well, they're not, but they run away, right? Serfs will increasingly run away to the towns, and the townspeople want them there. They need their labor. So when the Lord comes to the town to look for his serf, they're going to hide that serf. And there was it depended, I believe, based on region and time, but there was saying, town air makes one free. And what that meant was, if you lived in the town for like a year and a day, you became a citizen of the town, basically. You may not have the full rights, but you basically became a resident of the town. And you could not be taken back, right, to your farm. You were now a townsman, a townswoman, and the Lord could not legally take you there. Usually it was like a year and a day. So what's going to happen is this demand for labor is going to lead these towns to get bigger, and for serfs to leave the fields to come work in the towns. And other serfs who stay on the farm, well, the Lord needs them too, right? They're necessary as well. There's less serfs to do the work the Lord wants to be done. There's less serfs there to do the work the noble wants to be done. So they're going to say, well, you know what? If you want me to keep working for you and not run away, I need better conditions. I want more time to work on my own. Or I don't want to have to perform these old duties I had to do for you. Typically, serfs had to work a number of days a week on the Lord's land. And some serfs will say, well, you know what? I don't want to be a serf anymore. I want to become a tenant farmer, right? I want the right just to negotiate with you rent, and I'll rent the farm from you, but I don't want to do any of these other things that a serf has to do. And most of all, I want the right to be able to leave if I want to. And what's striking about this is that frequently lords were okay with this, right? Many lords were fine with this, both because they didn't want the serfs to run away, but also because they found that if they allowed the serfs to keep the surplus, production went up. So if serfs only had to pay a percentage of crops in terms of rent, the serfs would work harder knowing that they could sell their surplus on the market, and that would increase the amount that they produced, and the Lord would get more anyway and wouldn't have to have all the bother of trying to make the serfs work. And serfs often were very lazy when it was their day to work on the Lord's land. They would not work very hard if they could help it. You can't blame them because they were being forced to work on his land. But the key thing what we have here is the serfs that remain behind often become more productive because increasingly they'll become free. They'll become, now they often don't own the land. They're tenant farmers. They're paying a rent, often very high rent, but they're allowed to keep the surplus, so they work harder and produce more. Moreover, what's very important is how the towns work politically. Increasingly, what's going to happen is nobles or kings in whose land the towns are will give the towns a lot of freedoms, will give the towns a lot of the ability to self-govern. So towns will increasingly become self-governing. And they'll govern themselves in a way that's good for business, that's good for production. So that will lead to even more economic development. Now, why would they do this? Taxes, right? The Lord, in exchange for taxes, will kind of let towns do their own thing. And that's a good deal for everyone because the Lord still gets money, often an increasing amount of money. As the economy gets bigger, the Lord gets more and more money, and the Lord doesn't have to mess with the town, right? Other than making sure that no one invades the town, he doesn't have to go there often. He doesn't have to deal with justice. The town takes care of itself. That sounds like a win-win-win-win situation to me, right? Lord gets more money, has to do less work. The town gets more money and gets to take care of its own affairs and directs it in a way that helps the economy to grow. So just to give you an example of how this might work, lords often in their own land would have a toll or a toll road or a toll booth or something like that. So if you want to go across a bridge, you would maybe have to pay money. And I'm not talking about between different countries. I'm talking about within the same country or within the same holdings of the Lord. So you can imagine you want to go trade. You want to take stuff from one town to another town, and you have to go past 3 toll bridges. Each one of those tolls is going to cost you money and eat into your profits. So you're going to have less trade. But a lot of times what will happen is there will be negotiations between the Lord and the towns, and the Lord will get rid of the toll booths and say, okay, fine, I won't charge you a toll. You just pay me a little bit extra money and we won't do the toll anymore. So the Lord gets extra money, but then trade goes up because now more people can trade because they don't have to pay the toll booth money, right? They can make more money this way, so there's going to be more trade. So the economy gets bigger. And so increasingly what is happening in Europe is that the government, the various governments of Europe realize that if they step back and let towns kind of run themselves and they allow the economy to develop and maybe help here and there, but at least don't get in the way of the economy, they get richer without really having to do much. So there's increasing economic freedom in Europe that leads to more and more wealth. So kings and nobles learn that prosperous towns make them a lot of money, and so they encourage them. And you may have heard, and this comes from this time period actually, this story of the goose that laid the golden egg. It's a story of a farmer who has a goose that lays golden eggs, but alas, he becomes greedy and cuts open the goose to try and get all the eggs out because he wants them all now. Now, of course, what would have been smarter is just keep the goose alive and let it keep laying golden eggs, right? Don't get greedy. So there's a temptation by a king or a lord to say, oh, those merchants have a lot of money. I would like that money. I'm the king. I'm going to take it. And in some civilizations, this was a serious problem where people would actually become quite wealthy through trade, but they would hide their wealth from the government. Even though they had a lot of money, they didn't want to live richly. They didn't want to spend that money because they knew that it would be taken from them by the government. And the problem is when you have a government that extracts too much in terms of taxes, that takes too much away, then you have no incentive for development. You're killing the golden egg, the goose that lays the golden egg, right? If people figure out a new way to farm and you extract the entire surplus, there's no incentive to learn a new way to farm. But what's happening in Western Europe in particular, and I don't want to stress that, I need to stress this isn't perfect, it's not always consistent, but for the most part, there's an inclination towards saying, you know what? If we let the economy and merchants do their own thing, if we create a positive business environment, if we let them get wealthy, that actually gives us kings and nobles more money in the long run, because that allows them to pay even higher taxes. And you kind of think about it this way, right? 10% on $50,000 is $5,000, but 10% on $100,000 is $10,000. So if you let the merchant get richer and still tax that merchant the same, you're making more money without increasing taxes. Good deal all around. So the point I'm trying to make here is what we have going on in Europe is increasing economic freedom based on the realization that allowing that encourages economic development is really helping people, is helping the economy to grow and making everyone richer. Don't think that people are rich. They're not. But we're getting the foundation necessary for Europe to really become more and more powerful, economically speaking. And you can't do anything without the help of the economy.